Jesus and his disciples left for the villages around Caesarea Philippi. On the way, he put this question to his disciples: "Who do people say I am?" And they told him, "John the Baptist," they said. "Others Elijah, others again one of the prophets. But you," he asked, "who do you say I am?" Peter spoke up and said to him, "You are the Christ." And he gave them strict orders not to tell anyone about him. And he began to teach them that the Son of Man was destined to suffer grievously, to be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes, and to be put to death. And after 3 days he would rise again. And he said all this quite openly. Then, taking him aside, Peter started to remonstrate with him. But turning and seeing his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said to him, "Get behind me, Satan, because the way you think is not God's way, but man's." He called the people and his disciples to him and said, "If anyone wants to be a follower of mine, let him renounce himself and take up his cross and follow me. For anyone who wants to save his life will lose it, but anyone who loses his life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it." Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson went on a camping holiday. One night, Holmes turned to Watson and said, "Watson, look up and tell me what you can see." And Watson looked up and said, "I see the sky full of stars." And Holmes said, "And what does that tell you?" "Well, astronomically, it tells me that we are on a planet going round a sun that's only one of millions upon millions of stars in the sky, that there are billions of galaxies." Theologically, it speaks to me of the wonder of God's creation, the vast power, creative power of God who created all of this, and yet still has time for each one of us. Meteorologically, tells me that the sky is clear if I can see all these stars, and that promises to give us another gorgeous day tomorrow. Why, Holmes? What does it tell you? It tells me that someone's stolen our tent. Scholars tell us that this passage of the Gospel is at the very heart of the Gospel. That everything that has come before it, from the beginning of the Gospel right up to now, has been leading up to this point, to this moment of revelation. And everything that follows on, flows from this moment, is interpreted in the light of what Peter says and Jesus reveals. Everything has been leading up to revealing the secret identity of Jesus. And Jesus is examining his disciples at this moment to see whether they really understood. They've got the point of where he's been leading them. They've got to where he's been leading them. And it's Peter who speaks up on their behalf. "You are the Christ. You are the Messiah. You are the one that the world has been waiting for, the Holy One of God." Peter passes Jesus' test with flying colours, top marks. At least the first part of the test, the theory, the theology, the doctrine. But there's a second part too, the practical. How do you put into practice what you have said in words? And that's where Peter fails. Peter doesn't really grasp what he has just said. And Jesus fails him. Bottom of the class, "Get behind me, Satan." Just like Watson on the camping trip with Holmes. Watson was great in theory, but when it came to practical applications, he failed. And Peter does the same. He's just said that Jesus is the Christ, God's anointed, And yet, as soon as Jesus tells him how things will play out, Peter objects. This can't happen. Jesus says this is what is going to happen, and Jesus objects. He's complaining to God's anointed that God's anointed is going about it the wrong way. You see, the measure of discipleship isn't necessarily the words that we use, but the way we live in the light of those words, the way we apply them, we put them into practice. We can say all the right things in our creeds and in our prayers, but if we're not living them, then we're not living as true disciples. We still haven't got the point that Jesus is making. We're still not living the life that Jesus is leading us to. We still haven't got there. And that's okay, because Jesus didn't stop Peter following. He didn't try and stop him, discourage him from continuing to learn, to continuing to improve, even after the resurrection. When Jesus was no longer physically present to teach him, Peter continued to grow in his faith and in the way in which he practiced it. And that's all that we're being invited to do. We've reached that moment of revelation where we can say Jesus is the Christ. Now is the time to practice that faith.